You think you know what it's like to be alone? I mean truly alone, out where the wind screams like a banshee and the nearest soul is a half-day's ride away. That was Thomas Hargrove's world, a world of snow, silence, and ghosts. The winter of 1883 came early to Wyoming, and it came with teeth. Thomas felt it in his bones, the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it seeped inside and tried to freeze your heart. He was securing the last of the sheep in his barn, the lantern in his hand throwing wild, dancing shadows. His breath plumed in the air, a ghost of its own. Then he heard it, a howl, not just one, but a chorus, riding the storm like a declaration of war. They were close, too close. The wolves had come. He reached for the Winchester rifle propped against the barn wall. The cold steel was a familiar shock to his hands, a feeling he knew well. 5 years after the war, 5 years after Antietam, he still woke up reaching for a weapon. Some scars, you see, aren't on the skin. His old hound, Blue, growled low beside him, the fur on his back standing up like a thorny ridge. The dog was old, ancient by frontier standards, but his eyes were sharp. "I hear them too, boy," Thomas rasped, his voice rough from not being used for days. Out here, words were a luxury. The lantern flame flickered, almost dying in a gust of wind, and in that stuttering light, he saw them. Eyes, yellow, hungry eyes, blinking out of the darkness at the edge of the tree line. One pair, then another, then five. The sheep bleated behind the barn door, their fear a thick, musky scent in the air. He'd lost 3 to the wolves last winter. He couldn't afford to lose a single one this year. Not with the price of wool down and the cost of survival going up every single day. The lead wolf, a massive gray beast that looked more like a demon than a dog, stepped out from the trees. It was lean, starved, its ribs showing even from a distance. Its yellow eyes were locked on the barn. Thomas raised the rifle, the worn stock settling into the familiar groove of his shoulder. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The wolf didn't flinch. It just stared at him, a cold intelligence in its gaze. Man versus beast, both starving, both fighting a winter that wanted them both dead. Then the wolf took a step forward, and another. The rest of the pack fanned out, a perfect, practiced hunting formation. They weren't just hungry, they were smart. Thomas knew a warning shot wouldn't be enough. Not tonight. He aimed again, this time at the alpha's paws, trying to scare it off. The rifle roared, but the pack was too bold, too desperate. The lead wolf darted left, drawing his eye, while 2 others exploded from the right, rushing the barn. It was a classic pincer move. Thomas swung the rifle, fired, and missed as the wolf zigzagged through the snow. He cursed, chambering another round, but he was too slow. Something slammed into his back, a solid wall of muscle and fur, driving him face first into a snowdrift. Hot, stinking breath washed over his neck. Before he could even think, jaws clamped down on his forearm. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up his arm as teeth punched through his heavy coat, through the muscle, all the way to the bone. He roared, a sound of pure fury, not fear, and drove his free elbow back with all his might. He felt ribs crack. The wolf yelped but held on, its jaws grinding, trying to sever the limb. Thomas's world narrowed to that single point of agony. He couldn't reach his rifle. He was pinned, but he wasn't a soldier for nothing. His free hand scrabbled at his belt, fingers closing around the cold handle of his hunting knife. With one fluid, desperate motion, he drew the blade and plunged it upward, deep into the wolf's side. The animal screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and its jaws finally released. Thomas scrambled to his feet, blood pouring from his arm, staining the pure white snow a sickening crimson. Blue was locked in a snarling battle with another wolf, a whirlwind of teeth and claws. The other 3 wolves were circling, looking for an opening, their yellow eyes glowing in the dark. Thomas grabbed his fallen rifle, swinging it like a club, cracking the butt of it against the skull of the nearest wolf. The animal dropped with a whimper. He chambered another round, one-handed, his injured arm hanging uselessly. He fired at the wolf that had Blue pinned down. The shot was true. The wolf collapsed. Blue limped back to his side, muzzle bloody, but alive. Together they stood against the last 2 wolves. Man and dog, bleeding in the snow, surrounded by the storm. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. It was a standoff. Then the alpha, the great gray beast, let out a low growl and began to back away, melting back into the storm. The last one followed. They were gone. Thomas sagged against the barn door, the adrenaline leaving him in a rush, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. His arm was a mess. Blue whined and licked his good hand. "We made it, boy," he whispered. This time, he didn't bother thanking God. Survival out here wasn't a blessing. It was just a delay. The wolves would be back. The winter would get worse. The snow would bury everything. He looked toward his small cabin, a single point of light in the overwhelming darkness. An empty house, filled with empty memories. He'd built it for Eleanor, his wife. He'd come home from the war to find her and their newborn daughter buried under the big elm tree out back. He wrapped a handkerchief around his bleeding arm, picked up the lantern, and started the long walk back to that empty house. The snow was falling harder now, covering his tracks, covering the blood, erasing any sign that he had ever fought, that he had ever existed at all. And that was just the way he liked it. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that the wolves weren't the only thing the storm had brought to his door that night. The real danger, the real test, was already waiting for him, and it was hiding in his barn. 3 days later, the pain in Thomas's arm was a living thing, a fire that crept up from his wrist toward his shoulder. The wolf's teeth had gone deep, and the angry red lines spreading from the punctures told him what he already knew. Infection was setting in. He sat at his rough-hewn table, a bottle of whiskey and a needle and thread laid out before him. The nearest doctor was a half-day's ride in good weather. In this snow, it might as well be on the moon. He poured whiskey over the wound, hissing as the alcohol scoured the torn flesh. 5 deep holes, a perfect map of the wolf's jaw. Blue watched him from the fireside, the old dog's eyes filled with a worry that was almost human. "Lucky dog," Thomas muttered. Blue had gotten off with a few scratches. Thomas was about to stitch his own skin together when the dog's head shot up, ears pricked. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Thomas froze, listening. Over the shriek of the wind, he heard something else, a sound that didn't belong, a scrape, then a thud. It came from the direction of the barn. Blue was on his feet now, hackles raised, his growl deepening into a threat. Thomas set down the needle and reached for the Winchester. It couldn't be wolves. Wolves don't scrape and thud. A bear, maybe? Or a drifter, desperate for shelter. He pulled on his heavy coat, wincing as the rough wool scraped his injured arm. He opened the cabin door, and a wall of wind and snow hit him. The world was white and gray, the full moon a pale, ghostly eye staring through the clouds. The barn was a dark shape, 30 yards away, almost swallowed by the storm. "Come on," he said to Blue. The dog bounded ahead, a dark blur against the snow. The barn door was latched just as he'd left it. But Blue wasn't circling the door. He was sniffing at the western wall, pawing at a large pile of hay. Then Thomas heard it again, a muffled sound from inside. Not sheep. It sounded almost like a voice. Thomas unlatched the door, his rifle raised. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp. "Show yourself." Silence. Then Blue barked, a single sharp sound that echoed in the cold air. Thomas lifted his lantern. The sheep were huddled at the far end, their eyes like dozens of tiny flames. But Blue was still at the pile of hay, digging now, insistent. As Thomas got closer, the hay shifted. Not from the dog, from something underneath. "I said show yourself," Thomas growled, leveling the rifle. "I won't ask again." Slowly the hay parted. A small face emerged. A girl, no more than 10 years old, her dark hair matted with straw, her eyes wide with a fear so deep it stole his breath. Then behind her, another, smaller face appeared. A little girl clutching her sister, looking like a terrified ghost. Thomas lowered his rifle, the shock of it hitting him harder than the wolf had. What in God's name was this? "Please don't shoot," the older girl said, her voice shaking but steady. "We didn't steal anything. We needed somewhere warm." The younger girl, who couldn't be more than 6 or 7, clung to her sister, her face buried in the older girl's shoulder. Both were dressed in rags, clothes so thin they offered no protection from the brutal Wyoming winter. "How did you get here?" Thomas asked, his mind racing. The nearest town was miles away. "Where are your parents?" The older girl swallowed hard. "Our mother. She died 3 days ago." Her chin lifted, a tiny spark of defiance in her eyes. "That man. He's looking for us. We have nowhere else to go." That man. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. Thomas stood there frozen. Two little girls, orphaned and on the run, hiding in his barn in the middle of a blizzard. Blue had stopped barking and was now sniffing at them curiously, his tail giving a hesitant wag. The younger one shrank back, but the older one held her ground, a tiny, fierce protector. "You can't stay here," Thomas said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was a man who could barely take care of himself. What was he supposed to do with two children? "Just for tonight," the older girl pleaded, "until the storm passes. Then we'll be gone." "Go where?" The question was a silent scream in the cold barn. The wind howled outside, a reminder of the death that waited for anyone caught in its grip. He couldn't turn them out. Not even he was that cruel. He let out a long sigh, a sound of pure defeat. "What are your names?" "I'm Sarah," the older one said. "This is my sister, Grace." The little one, Grace, said nothing, just watched him with huge, haunted eyes. Thomas gave a single curt nod. A decision made. A decision he already knew he would regret. "Come on then," he said, turning toward the door without looking back. "The house is warmer." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then he heard the rustle of hay and the soft tread of small feet following him. The wolves suddenly seemed like a much simpler problem. The cabin, which had always felt empty, now felt small, crowded. The girls, Sarah and Grace, huddled by the fire, eating the stew Thomas had heated for them. They ate slowly, carefully, like creatures who had learned that every bite might be their last. Grace hadn't spoken a single word. She just clutched a small, dirty cloth bag to her chest as if it held the last bit of hope in the world. Thomas sat in his rocking chair, as far from them as he could get, nursing his whiskey and his throbbing arm. Blue, the traitor, had positioned himself between Thomas and the girls, as if he couldn't decide who to guard. "Is your arm hurt?" Sarah asked suddenly. Her eyes were sharp. They missed nothing. "Wolf," Thomas grunted. Her eyes widened. "You fought a wolf?" "5 of them," he said, and immediately wished he hadn't. The look on her face changed from fear to something like awe. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. That man was long dead. "You said your mother died," Thomas said, changing the subject. "What about your father?" Sarah's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Her face went blank, like a shutter closing. "He's the one looking for us," she said, her voice flat, cold. She offered nothing else. Thomas didn't push. Some doors are better left unopened. His plan was simple. When the storm broke, he'd take them to town. Let the sheriff or the preacher deal with them. Anyone but him. He gave them his bed for the night, the one with the quilt Eleanor had made. He hadn't used it in 5 years. He watched them huddle together under it, 2 dark-haired little sparrows in his lonely nest. "She doesn't talk much," Sarah said, noticing him watching. "Not since." She trailed off. Thomas knew what she meant. Some things steal your words. He settled into his rocking chair for the night, the whiskey bottle his only companion. He didn't plan on sleeping. He couldn't, not with strangers in his house. After he was sure they were asleep, he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn soft. A letter, sealed with a wax stamp, an elegant M. He'd carried it for 5 years. Never opened it. It was the last letter Eleanor's midwife had written to him, delivered with the news that his wife and child were dead. He couldn't bring himself to read it. He just couldn't. From the bed, Grace whimpered in her sleep. Sarah murmured something, soothing her. Thomas watched them, 2 lost children who had washed up on the shore of his desolate life. Tomorrow they'd be gone. His solitude would return. So why did that thought feel like a stone in his gut? He was still awake in the dead of night when the whispering started. It was Sarah's voice, soft and urgent. "Is he coming?" I thought I heard him. Grace must have whimpered because Sarah whispered again. No, he can't find us here. We ran too far. The snow will cover our tracks. Thomas stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep. This wasn't for him. I know you miss her, Sarah murmured. I do too. But she told us to run. Remember? She said Mr. Hargrove would help us. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Mr. Hargrove. How could their mother have known his name? He hadn't spoken to a new soul in years. He's not scary, Sarah whispered, her voice full of a strange confidence. Not really. He has sad eyes like Mama did sometimes, and he fought 5 wolves all by himself. The pride in her voice was a strange twisting thing in his chest. We'll be safe here tonight, Sarah promised her little sister. Tonight, we're safe. That childish certainty hit Thomas like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd felt safe? Not since before the war. He opened his eyes, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. His gaze drifted to the old photograph of Eleanor on the mantel. What would you do? He asked her silently. Eleanor would have taken them in, no questions asked. Her heart was big enough for all the world's strays. But Eleanor was gone, and he wasn't the man she'd married. That man had been left behind on a battlefield, buried in the mud with thousands of others. She said Mr. Hargrove would help us. The words echoed in the silent cabin. Who was this woman? And what kind of help did she think he could offer? He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving a world buried in white. His arm was worse, the skin around the bites an angry, swollen red. He had to get to town, to a doctor. As he fed the sheep, the girl's mother's words kept playing in his mind. Who was she? How did she know him? When he got back to the cabin, Sarah was awake. It looks worse, she said, her eyes fixed on his arm. It'll keep, he grunted. My mother knew how to treat wounds, she offered quietly. She showed me some things. Thomas hesitated. A 10-year-old girl? But the pain was getting worse, and he was out of options. Breakfast first, he said. Then we talk about getting you to town. The hope on Sarah's face died, but she just nodded. At the table, Grace was still silent, still clutching her little cloth bag. What's in there? Thomas finally asked. Grace's eyes went wide with panic. It's okay, Sarah said quickly. He won't take it. She looked at her sister, a silent conversation passing between them. Then Grace gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah carefully opened the bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A letter. She handed it to Thomas. It was sealed with wax, a familiar wax stamp, an ornate M. It was identical to the seal on the letter he'd been carrying in his own pocket for 5 years. The world seemed to lurch sideways. He stared at the seal, then at Sarah. His own unopened letter was from the midwife who attended Eleanor's death. This letter from the girl's mother had the exact same seal. What did it mean? What impossible connection tied his dead wife to these 2 runaway children? Our mother, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She said to give it to you. She said it would explain everything. Thomas's hands were shaking. 2 letters, 2 identical seals. One carried for 5 years in grief-stricken silence. The other delivered by 2 small, terrified messengers. His carefully constructed solitude, the walls he'd built around his broken heart, were about to be shattered. He didn't know if he was ready for the truth. He didn't know if he could survive it. But looking at the hope in Sarah's eyes, he knew he didn't have a choice. He had to open it. He had to know. But before he could break the seal, another thought hit him, colder than the Wyoming snow. The seal. The midwife's last name was Montgomery. The preacher in town, the one Thomas couldn't stand, was Reverend Montgomery. And he was known for being a harsh, judgmental man who talked about his estranged sister who had strayed from the path of righteousness. What if these girls weren't just strangers? What if they were the preacher's own nieces? The complications of his life had just multiplied, and he hadn't even read the first word. The journey to redemption was brutal. The snow was deep, the air was a razor in his lungs, and the fever from his infected arm was starting to take hold. The world swam at the edges of his vision. Sarah and Grace huddled under blankets in the sledge, 2 small bundles of misery. Thomas just focused on keeping the horse moving forward. He had to get to the doctor. He had to get the girls somewhere safe. And he had to figure out what to do with the 2 letters burning a hole in his pocket. They finally crested the ridge overlooking the town just as the sun was setting. Redemption. A handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the vast, empty wilderness. As they rode down the main street, curtains twitched. People stopped and stared. A man like Thomas Hargrove didn't come to town unless something was very wrong, and he sure as hell didn't show up with 2 strange children. He pulled the sledge to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read, Carson's Apothecary. Before he could even move, the door opened. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the warm lamplight. Abigail Carson, a widow in her late 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Thomas Hargrove, she said, her voice dry. I was beginning to think you'd finally frozen solid out on that ridge of yours. Her gaze shifted to the sledge, her eyebrows shooting up. You've acquired company. Found them in my barn, Thomas mumbled. And then the world tilted. He swayed in his seat, a wave of dizziness washing over him. Abigail was at his side in an instant, her cool hand on his forehead. You're burning up, she stated, her voice losing all its sarcasm. What happened? Wolf bite, Sarah answered for him, pushing back her hood. It's infected. Well, let's get all of you inside before Mr. Hargrove falls off this sledge and makes more work for me, Abigail said, her efficiency taking over. She helped him down, her strength surprising. Inside, the apothecary was warm and smelled of dried herbs and medicine. She eased him into a chair and began unwrapping the bandage on his arm. Her face grew grim. You fool, she scolded gently. You should have come days ago. It's my fault, Sarah said, her small voice filled with guilt. If we hadn't shown up? I doubt that, Abigail said, not looking up. Thomas Hargrove avoids this town like the plague. It would have taken more than a wolf bite to bring him in. She looked at Sarah, her expression softening. Now what's this about you 2 showing up? While Abigail worked, her young assistant, a quiet boy named Jacob, brought hot water. She cleaned and drained the wound, the pain so intense that Thomas nearly blacked out. Through the haze, he heard Abigail talking, piecing together the story from Sarah's hesitant answers. The dead mother, the father they were running from, the name, Porter. Then, just as she was finishing, the front door burst open. Doc Simmons, the town's grizzled, often drunk physician, stomped in. Heard we had an emergency, he boomed. He took one look at Thomas. Wolf bite, bad one. He peered at Abigail's work. You did a good job, Abby. He might even live. Just then the door opened again, but this time it wasn't a friend. It was Sheriff Wilson, and he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a man Thomas had never seen before. A tall man, well-dressed with a handsome face and a charming smile. But his eyes were as cold and dead as a frozen river. Sheriff, the man said, his voice smooth as polished stone. I believe you found my daughters. The world stopped. Sarah let out a small, terrified gasp and grabbed Grace, pulling her behind her. Blue, who had been lying quietly, rose to his feet, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. James Porter had found them, and he had brought the law with him. Now, Mr. Porter, Sheriff Wilson said, his voice calm but firm, let's not jump to conclusions. There are no conclusions to jump to, Porter said, his charming smile never wavering. He held up a set of papers. Marriage certificate, birth records for Sarah and Grace Porter. My wife, bless her troubled soul, took my girls from our home in Laramie. I've been searching for them for weeks, half out of my mind with worry. His story was perfect. He was the concerned father, the grieving husband. Thomas, sitting there bleeding and feverish, looked like a desperate kidnapper. Sarah tried to speak. He's lying. Hush, Sarah, Porter said, his voice turning cold for just a second. The adults are talking. The girls are terrified, Abigail cut in, her voice sharp as glass. And Mr. Hargrove is in no condition to be interrogated. Whatever this is, it can wait until morning. Porter's smile returned. Of course, how thoughtless of me. I'm just so relieved to have found them. I'll get a room at the hotel. We can sort this all out in the morning. He looked at Sarah and Grace, his eyes lingering on them with a look of possession that made Thomas's blood run cold. I'll see you tomorrow, my darlings. He and the sheriff left. The silence in the apothecary was deafening. Sarah was trembling, trying to comfort Grace, who was shaking uncontrollably. What are we going to do? Sarah whispered, looking at Thomas, her eyes begging for an answer he didn't have. He was trapped. Porter had the law, the story, the appearance of a respectable man. All Thomas had was the word of a terrified child and a sealed letter in his pocket. A letter that might change everything, or nothing at all. He looked at Abigail, whose face was a mask of grim determination. He's not getting those girls, she said, her voice low and fierce. How do we stop him? Thomas asked, the fever making his head spin. First, she said, pressing a glass of bitter-smelling liquid into his hand, you're going to stay alive. Then, we fight. But as Thomas drank the medicine and felt the darkness of unconsciousness pulling him under, he knew this was a fight they couldn't win. Porter had them cornered. There was no way out. Or was there? Thomas woke up 2 days later in a strange bed. The fever had broken. Abigail was sitting in a chair beside him. You've been unconscious for 2 days, she told him. The infection was bad. We almost lost you. She filled him in. The girls were safe, staying with her. Grace had even spoken a few words. But the whole town was buzzing, and Sheriff Wilson was stuck. Porter had the law on his side. He was a pillar of patience, the perfect concerned father, waiting to be reunited with his children. I need my coat, Thomas said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Abigail looked at him confused, but she got it for him. He pulled out the 2 letters. His hands were still shaking as he broke the seal on the one Sarah had given him. He read it, and the world shifted on its axis. The letter was from Mary Montgomery, the midwife, the preacher's sister. She told him everything, how she had fled redemption after Eleanor's death, haunted by the loss, how she had met and married James Porter, how he had seemed kind at first, and how that kindness had curdled into control, then cruelty. She wrote about the bruises, about the fear, about how he was breaking Grace's spirit, and she wrote that she was dying. I am sending them to you, Thomas, the letter read. I met you only once, but I saw the goodness in your eyes buried under all that grief. You are the only one I can trust. Keep my daughter safe. It explained everything. The identical seal, her knowing his name, but it also revealed an even more shocking truth. Sarah and Grace were Reverend Montgomery's nieces. Then, his hands trembling, he opened the other letter, the one he'd carried, unread, for 5 years. It was also from Mary. It described Eleanor's last moments, how brave she was, how her last words were his name, and it told him something he never knew. Their daughter, the baby who had died at birth. She had lived for a single breath, just one. And in that one moment, Mary had baptized her, just as Eleanor had asked. I named her Hope, the letter said. Thomas broke down. 5 years of grief, held back by a dam of anger and silence, came pouring out. Hope. His daughter's name was Hope. This woman, this stranger, had given him a gift he never knew he needed. And now she had given him another, a sacred trust. 2 little girls who were counting on him. He showed the letters to Abigail. Her face was a storm of emotions as she read. The Reverend, she said, we have to tell him. But just as she spoke, Jacob, her young assistant, burst into the room, his face pale with panic. It's Porter, he stammered. He's at the sheriff's office. He's got a judge's order from Cheyenne. He's taking the girls. Right now. There was no time. The law was on Porter's side. The truth didn't matter. Not to a piece of paper signed by a judge 100 miles away. Thomas looked at Abigail. In her eyes, he saw the same desperate, defiant fire that he felt in his own chest. No, Thomas said, pushing himself out of the bed, his body screaming in protest. He's not. What are you going to do? Abigail asked, already moving, gathering supplies, her mind working as fast as his. I made a promise, Thomas said, pulling on his boots. I'm going to keep it. They had to run. It was their only choice. Abigail created a diversion at the front of the apothecary, arguing with Porter and the sheriff, buying them precious minutes. Jacob led Thomas and the girls out the back. He had horses ready, packed with food and medicine. An unexpected blizzard was rolling in, a dark wall of clouds on the horizon. It was their only hope. A deadly storm was their only chance at salvation. "The storm will cover your tracks," Jacob whispered, helping Sarah and Grace onto a gentle mare. "Head for your ranch. It's the one place he might not think to look right away." Thomas pulled himself onto his own horse, every muscle screaming. He looked back and saw Abigail standing in an upstairs window, watching them go. He raised a hand. She raised one back. Then they were gone, melting into the alleys of redemption, fugitives from a law that was supposed to protect the innocent. As they rode out of town, the first flakes of snow began to fall. The wind was rising, moaning through the pines. Behind them, James Porter had the law. He had the power. But ahead of them, in the heart of the storm, Thomas Hargrove had something more. He had hope, and he would die before he let anyone take that from him again. The ride back to the ranch was a frozen hell. The blizzard hit them with the force of a physical blow, a screaming wall of white that erased the world. Thomas rode in front, his body a block of ice, the fever from his arm returning with a vengeance. He could barely see, barely think. He just kept the horse moving, trusting its instincts to find the way home. Hours later, when the dark shape of his cabin finally appeared through the swirling snow, he was on the verge of collapse. He got the girls and the horses inside just as his strength gave out. The last thing he remembered was Sarah's terrified face as he fell into the blackness of his returning fever. He was lost for 2 days, trapped in a nightmare world of fever dreams. He saw Eleanor's face, heard wolves howling his name, felt the cold of the grave. But through it all, there were moments of grace, a cool cloth on his head, a cup of water at his lips, and a soft, sweet voice, singing a lullaby he hadn't heard since he was a boy. When he finally woke up, weak but clear-headed, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed into the cabin. Grace was sitting by his bed watching him. "Better?" she asked, the single word a miracle. "Better," he croaked. Sarah came in from outside, her cheeks red from the cold. She had been taking care of everything. She'd tended to his wound, using the medicine Abigail had sent. She'd found his snares and caught rabbits for them to eat. She'd kept the fire going. This 10-year-old girl had kept them all alive. "You were talking in your sleep," she told him, "about someone named Eleanor and a baby named Hope." He told them. He told them everything. About his wife, about his daughter, about the letters. And for the first time in 5 years, speaking their names didn't feel like swallowing glass. It felt like coming home. They settled into a strange, fragile peace. For 3 days, they were a family. Thomas taught Sarah how to track. Grace, now talking more and more, showed him the small animals she was learning to carve from scraps of wood. They were safe. They were healing. But they all knew it was temporary. A calm in the eye of the storm. Then they saw him, a lone rider picking his way through the deep snow. It was Sheriff Wilson. "He's found us," Sarah whispered. "Stay inside," Thomas said, grabbing his Winchester. He met the sheriff on the porch. "You've put me in a hell of a spot, Thomas," Wilson said, his face grim. "Porter is raising hell back in town. He's got that court order. I can't ignore it forever." "Those girls are not going back with him," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I know," the sheriff said, and the words shocked Thomas. "I don't trust him either, Thomas. There's something wrong with that man. Abigail's been talking to folks in town, digging into his past. The stories aren't good, but my hands are tied, unless what?" "I talked to the Reverend," Wilson said. "I showed him the letters. It took a while. The man is colder than a banker's heart. But when he saw the picture Grace drew of the lily of the valley, he broke. He remembered his sister. He's agreed to file for guardianship. As their blood relative, his claim could override Porter's. It was a chance. A long shot, but a chance. But they were out of time. As they spoke, another sound reached them. Hoofbeats. 2 riders coming fast. It was James Porter, and he had a hired man with him. They weren't waiting for the law anymore. They had come to take the girls by force. "Get inside with the girl," Wilson yelled, drawing his pistol. "This is my problem now." But Thomas knew it wasn't. It was his. He sent the sheriff to guard the back and stood at the front door, the Winchester heavy in his hands. Porter and his man dismounted, guns drawn. "It's over, Hargrove," Porter shouted. "Give me my daughters." "They're not your daughters anymore." Thomas yelled back, "They're home!" The world exploded in gunfire. A bullet splintered the door frame next to Thomas's head. He fired back, driving them to cover. From the back of the cabin, he heard more shots. Wilson was holding his own, but they were pinned down. It was a siege. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Porter's man had circled around and set fire to the barn. The flames roared up, bright against the snow. Thomas watched in horror as his livelihood, his past, went up in smoke. But then he saw it. Porter was using the fire as a distraction, sneaking toward the side of the cabin, toward the window of the room where Sarah and Grace were hiding. There was no time to think. Thomas burst out the front door, firing as he ran, ignoring the bullets that zipped past his head. He tackled Porter just as the man was raising his gun to the window. They crashed to the ground, a desperate, rolling fight in the snow. Porter was strong, fueled by a mad rage. His hands found Thomas's throat, squeezing, the world going dark at the edges of his vision. He was going to lose. He was going to fail them. The thought of Sarah and Grace, of Eleanor and Hope, flashed through his mind. No, not again. With a last, desperate surge of strength, his hand found a loose rock, half buried in the snow. He swung it, connecting with Porter's temple with a sickening crunch. The hands on his throat went slack. Porter collapsed. Silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the burning barn and his own ragged breathing. Sheriff Wilson appeared, his arm bleeding, Porter's hired man in cuffs. It was over. A week later, they all stood before a circuit judge in Cheyenne. Reverend Montgomery was there. So was Abigail Carson. James Porter, his head bandaged, was led in chains. Sarah stood tall, holding Grace's hand, and told the judge everything. Her voice never wavered. When she was done, Grace stepped forward. She looked at Porter, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a cold, hard strength. "No more," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You don't scare me anymore." The judge didn't hesitate. James Porter was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, arson, and a list of other charges. He then turned to the matter of the girls. Reverend Montgomery stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Thomas had never heard from him before. "As their uncle, I would be honored to take them in, but—" He looked at Thomas. "They already have a home. They already have a father." The adoption was finalized that afternoon. Thomas Hargrove, the lonely hermit, walked out of the courthouse with his two daughters, Sarah and Grace Hargrove. Abigail was waiting for them outside. She was smiling, a real warm smile that reached her eyes. "Looks like you're going to need a bigger cabin," she said. "Or maybe just a house in town," Thomas replied, looking at her. For the first time, he wasn't just thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future. They rode home together, a strange and beautiful little family, forged in fire and ice. The ranch was a wreck, the barn a smoking ruin. But as they crested the ridge and looked down at the small cabin nestled in the valley, it didn't look empty anymore. It looked like a beginning. It looked like hope. What started with a wolf attack ended with the creation of a new family. It just goes to show you that sometimes the most terrifying storms bring the most unexpected gifts. What do you think? Can a man who lost everything truly find a new beginning? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story we drag out of the shadows. Thanks for watching.